Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Stephen D. Brewer, who is an author of science fiction and fantasy, I believe. And he is not the Stephen or Steve Brewer, who is a crime mystery author, and he's not the Stephen Brewer who was a senator in Massachusetts for a while, but he is a science fiction and fantasy author. And Stephen D. Brewer, could you could you please let us know or let the audience know a little bit about more about your work and about your latest book?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, but I also write science fiction and fantasy. I have two books that are out quite recently. My most recent book, well, the one that's most recent is actually a fix-up novel, Revin's Heart, that's kind of a steampunky fantasy adventure about pirates and airships and has a trans protagonist. And it's a fix-up in that it's a collection of seven novelettes that were my debut work that came out over the past couple of years and now are being released in a single volume, along with some interludes between each one of the novelettes, and then three additional side stories at the end, plus a little sneak preview of the sequel, which is called Devonshire.
Ah, okay. And your Better Angel?
So the Better Angels are a fluffy military space opera about a group of non-human biological androids that look like preteen girls and act as a magical girl singing and dancing troupe, but they can change up their programming and become a covert military force.
Mhm. That sounds really interesting. Now, Better Angels, Tour de Force is a second book in that series.
Well, the original story was a short story called Just Better Angels, and so that's 50 pages long or something like that. And it's also the first short story in Better Angels Tour de Force, which is an anthology, a collection of 17 stories. Originally, I was thinking about calling it 16 seriously sweet and sanguinary stories set on the truck stop at the center of the galaxy. And the editor said, well, we won't have to worry about artwork because there won't be any room for any on the cover if we use that as the title. But then I wrote another story, and so then there were 17, and so then, well, we went with Tour de Force.
Okay, can you tell me a little bit about? I know Truck Stop at the Center of the Galaxy is not yours, but could you tell me a little bit about it?
So it's a shared world anthology that Water Dragon Publishing, my publisher, works with, that they've created, and a number of authors have contributed stories to this particular setting. So it's a truck stop that's orbiting the black hole at the center of the galaxy. It was created by a race of aliens and had become derelict, and then humans took it over and have been kind of retrofitting it. And the original stories are set about 500 years earlier than the Better Angel stories, set in this one particular location. But it's been very interesting to read the work of the other authors that each have taken a different spin or a different take on it. And so it's sort of like, you have all these multiverses that intersect at this one location. And it's been a fascinating experience to write in this environment with a group of other authors that are all working with the same space.
Have you uh, talked with the other authors as you were writing this?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got a set of materials that were created that kind of describe the station and its characteristics so that we can all refer to it in more or less the same way. But then we also have meetings periodically where we get together and talk about things, although the stories are really quite different. And so in many ways, there are things that don't quite line up. And so, like I say, it's rather than being all tightly integrated in a single universe, it's much more like a kind of overlapping set of multiverses that have this one common feature in them, and then many of the other aspects of the universes are quite different.
Hmm.
But there was a woman, Patricia Monk, who wrote an article maybe 20 years ago talking about the phenomenon of shared world anthologies. The famous ones were Thieves' World in the past, and Callahan's was a really famous shared world feature that a bunch of authors contributed stories for. And in Patricia Monk's article, she talked about the way that it helped build rapport and build relationships among writers and gave them an opportunity to talk things through and discuss things. And that's very much the way I felt. It's been wonderful to have this supportive community of people that I can talk to about my ideas and that have been willing to read my stories and critique them. to make sure that we're all speaking about the place in a similar way.
Hmm. Now, since you knew that you were going to be writing in this shared world anthology, how did you get the idea, or how did you come up with the inspiration for Bitter Angels Tour de Force, or Bitter Angels?
So I was when I was writing Revin's Heart, that was the first work that I got published with Water Dragon, and then the editor invited me to write a story. And the thing that's the kind of conceit is that you have these non-human biological androids that are they're mechanistic in certain ways, but they're biological. They were a clean room genetic engineering, a re-engineering of the human genome, so that they don't share any human DNA, but they look like human beings, but yet they have a programming stack that has a whole series of different modules that control their behavior and their physiology and language. Most of those are common to all of the non-human biological androids, at least the ones that are human-like. There's some that are far less human. Cindy, the big pink snake, is also a non-human biological android, but she's snake-shaped. Um, and one so the guy that has taken the design for the Better Angels that were originally supposed to be pop stars and that has used them for a nefarious purpose. And the protagonist David wants to save the Better Angels and wants to liberate them from being used in this horrifying way. And at first you think that he's just a person that's doing this, but it turns out he's also a non-human biological android. And in general, the non-human biological androids serve the function of what you might think of as we would think of as androids or droids or something like that in the Star Wars universe. In that they're not considered for the most part to be fully competent and able to act on their own, but in point of fact they can. And that's what over the course of the stories you discover that David has learned how to make that happen so that the Better Angels can then be in control of their own destiny, that non-human biological androids can be fully functioning, emancipated individuals.
Hmm. But how did you come up with the inspiration for this?
I'm a biologist, and so I've thought about the idea of doing. I've been interested in biological engineering, that people are trying to recreate life kind of from first principles, and so they're
Mm.
trying to create artificial cells that instead of basically all of the engineered cells that we have now, you take a cell that's already working, some organism, and then they've been trying to remove the genes from it to try and come up with what are the minimum number of genes that you need to have in order to have a cell that works. And I was simply thought, well, what if you did that with a whole organism? What if instead of just doing a single cell, you were able to do a complete artificial reimplementation of the genome of a human being so that you've got a constructed human being, not one that is building on the existing evolved genome that human beings have.
Ah, okay. So how much research did you have to do for it?
I'm a biologist, and so this is something that I'm familiar with. I mean, there are a bunch of things that I did have to do research on. One of the things that I had to do is to read up about binary star systems and about singularities. And in one of the stories, the Better Angels and the monomaniacal menageriste, she's created this resort called the Iron Ball that basically took a big asteroid, used nanobots to consume all of the non-iron materials. So you just had the iron parts that were left, then carved out corridors and rooms in the whole thing, treated them all with acid so that you get the beautiful nickel iron lamellae, the Widmastatin patterns, and then coated them with polymer, and then added lights and carpeting and furniture. And so reading up about the structure of asteroids and the feasibility of doing something like this was that's one example of the kind of research that I've done. But yeah, I'm not an astrophysicist, and so if I
Hmm.
want to read about binary star systems and things like that, that's something I have to go off and read about. I don't just know those things.
Okay, what about for Revan's Heart? How did you get the idea for that?
So I originally wrote the first story as a riffing on the idea of Treasure Island. In the story of Treasure Island, you have Jim, a young man who ends up going off and then is involved with pirates. And at the end of the story, Jim just simply goes back to his regular life, now much wealthier from the pirate treasure that they discovered. And the leader of the pirates, Long John Silver, goes off and escapes, and then has further adventures, perhaps, although those are not described. Jim simply wonders what those might have been. And I always wondered what would have happened if Jim had gone off with the pirate and they had gone off and done things. Now, my story is not really a pastiche of Treasure Island, and the pirate captain in Revin's Heart is not a bloodthirsty killer like Long John Silver was. So they're not really the same story, but that was the genesis. That was the spark that gave me the idea for the stories.
Uh-huh. And there are several stories based on Revin's Heart?
So there are 7 stories that were the original novelettes that Revin's Heart's composed of, and those are each about 10,000 words. So Revin's Heart is about 70,000 words in length. And then there are 3 side stories that represent stories about characters from Revin's Heart, but where Revin himself is not present. And so one is Where There's a Will, which is about how the pirate captain and his first mate meet. There's one about Curtains Rise, which is about the pirate captain when he was a very young man meeting his first mate's father, who he didn't realize that they were related when he first met each one of them, and when he met his first mate later.
So it sounds, oh, sorry.
Oh, and then the last story is Reva's Escape, which is about Revin's transition story. That is, the stories Revin's Heart is about a young man who goes off and has these adventures. And so in those stories, Revin is just a young man. He's trans, and that brings up particular issues and challenges for him as he goes through. But it's not about him being trans. It's simply he's the character, and he has these unique experiences that he has to have, just as he would if he were, had any other particular quality about him. But Reva's Escape then is about his transition, where it begins when he's still female, and then it's about his transition to being male. Because I thought that was an important story to write, and it was interesting to me. I learned a lot about the character in writing that story that then allowed me to go back and revise some of the other novelettes that I had already written but had not yet been published.
It sounds as though you prefer to write shorter stories rather than a full novel.
I have written a whole novel, A Familiar Problem. I have as a manuscript that is ready to go. I haven't found a publisher for it yet, but it's certainly true that I find writing a novelette about 10,000 words to be, kind of a sweet spot for me. The sequels to Revin's Heart that I've written Devonshire and Campshire, which are both novella length. And so my goal is probably to bundle those together and to sell them as a companion volume with the 2 novelettes, or 2 novellas. They're each about 25,000 words. And but I think a story ought to be the length that the story needs to be. But telling novelette length stories is comfortable for me. It's a unit that I find feels nice.
How can you generally tell how long this story should be? I mean, it's very tough, isn't it?
Yeah, although again, I mean, in these cases, there's a coherent story arc, and then across Revin's Heart, there's one arc that goes across all of the stories. But each one has a particular beginning, a particular problem that the protagonist faces, and then an arc with hopefully rising action and then a satisfying resolution where you find a payoff, and that particular part of the story is resolved. I mean, they could be thought of as chapters, I think, but I was interested in serializing the story. I wrote the first one, and when I first wrote it, it was about 5,000 words long, and when I tried to get it published, it was rejected. And when I went back and looked at it, I realized that it wasn't really a story. It was much more like the first chapter of a book, which I'd always had the idea of this larger story in mind. But when I started writing again, because I originally wrote that in 2003, and submitted it in 2004, and it was rejected. And then I just set it aside and was doing other things for almost 20 years. But then I pulled it out and I looked at it and I realized that it needed to have its own internal coherent story arc. And so I added about 3,000, 4,000 more words to it, and I went and revised it substantially so that it had this, its own internal arc, even though it still could play the role of the introduction to a larger volume. And Water Dragon Publishing was interested in it, and they published it. And then I wrote the second one and pitched it to the editor, and he liked it enough that he said that he was willing to, on spec, let me write as many more as I needed to finish the story. And it turned out that 7 was the right number for telling the story that I wanted to tell.
Mm-hmm. Okay. When you write a story, do you have it outlined, or are you more of a pantser?
When I first started writing, I was very much writing from the seat of my pants. But after a while, I discovered that it produced anxiety to do that. I was worried that I would write myself into a corner. And so I began outlining, and I would produce relatively detailed outlines so that I knew kind of what the beats of the story were. But more recently, I've come to realize that, in fact, even if I have an outline, I'm not really afraid to diverge from the outline if the story seems to want to go in a different direction, that I can let it go in a different direction and just kind of go beyond the outline or keep writing after the end of the outline. And that writing the outline, as much as anything else, was a kind of therapy that let me address the anxiety I felt that I was worried that I would write myself into a corner, rather than actually serving as really guidance or guardrails or anything like that. So I do write outlines, but I'm not afraid to just let the story go where it needs to go if something better occurs to me as I'm writing it, which often happens.
Mm-hmm. And the characters that you create, they kind of come to you as the story goes.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I often have 2 or 3 characters that I have envisioned at the beginning, where I kind of understand that they're going to be the key players. But then, as I perceive the need for other characters, as the protagonists, go out into the world, they're going to meet other characters, and so they will show up. And some are more fleshed out than others. But I'm not somebody that ahead of time thinks of all the characters that I'm likely to need. I often start out with just kind of a very narrow sketch, and then new characters can sometimes take on a much greater prominence than I had originally realized they might.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So what was the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out, for say, Better Angels?
Better Angels. So I wrote the first story and it was reasonably well received, and so the editor invited me to write a couple more stories, and with the idea, I think, that they would be published just kind of singly, and so I wrote 2 stories, but then I realized I wanted to write another one, and then another one, and then another one, and so pretty soon I had such a large body. He said, let's just do a collection, and and so then, more than anything else, it was a matter of trying to make sure that the consistency was correct across all of them, in that to a certain extent, when you're writing stories like this, you want to have the stories come back to the same point. If you think about a Star Trek episode or something like that, at the end of the Star Trek episode, everything needs to be set back to the way it was at the beginning, so that then the next writer who's writing the next episode knows where things are. You often don't want to have, changes from one thing to another. But in my case, I did have a bunch of things that changed. And so then at the end, I needed to go back and make sure that those were all internally consistent, that I had, dealt with the new characters and where the new characters had shown up, and make sure that then in the later stories, I'm referring to the new characters, that I'm certain that they're present and I'm not leaving them out. And with the Better Angels, one of the challenges is just keeping track of, there's 9 Better Angels, and so you've got Bebe, Lala, Mumu, Nene, Popo, Rara, Sisi, Toto, Tutu, and Zaza. And so keeping track of all of them and making sure you know which one is where doing what all the time, that's perhaps the biggest challenge.
Hmm. Had you ever thought about taking your short stories and kind of putting them together into a novel?
So I really think that for the Better Angels, because they are this kind of fluffy, um, silly sort of thing, that it actually works much better in short fiction.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure it would hold up well in writing a whole novel. Although I do have some ideas for follow-on novels that might take place. I've written a couple of short stories that one in particular that I wrote that could have come out at Christmas as a Christmas story associated with the truck stop just promotionally. But it didn't come out then. But it basically lays the groundwork for what could be a follow-on novel that would be about the past catching up with David, the manager of the Better Angels, and that
Hmm.
I think that could be a lot of fun. That an investigative journalist is starting to get her teeth into what might be a big story, and then could generate a lot of problems for him.
Okay, so what was your favorite character in
I,
Better Angels?
I guess I'd have to say that Bebe is my favorite character because she's silly and off the wall and childish, and yet incredibly loyal and always comes through in a pinch. But she's always the one that is doing the off the wall thing, is saying the thing that nobody expects, and which that's me to a certain extent, and so I see a lot of myself in her.
Was it difficult to find a uh, a different, not character, but a different disposition for each one of the characters?
For the Better Angels, that hasn't actually turned out to be that difficult. Although I must admit that Zaza and Bebe are very distinctive. They have very distinctive personalities, and then the rest of them are much more uniform. And I mean, they're all supposed to be, they were all replicated, and they have the same programming stack, and so
Hmm.
they were absolutely identical, and then have only just begun to diverge a little bit in a short period of time that they've been around. They've only been in existence for about a year. It's not like they're children that grew up. They were replicated, fully formed at the, in the way that they are, and then they've only been in existence for about a year, and so they haven't been able to diverge very much for the most part. And so that means then that each one has a few distinctive characteristics associated with them, but it's not terribly hard to keep track of. In Revin's Heart, on the other hand, there I've got a lot more history. That now I've got dozens of characters that weave in and out of the story, and that they all have backstories that now go back 50 or 100 years, and are intersecting in all these complex ways. And so for that, it's a whole lot more work. I have to have a detailed timeline that shows all of the different events for the past 300 years and when different things happened, and who was where when, in order to keep track of all that stuff.
Haha. Okay. So, what can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, like I say, I've got the sequels to Revin's Heart that are functionally ready to go, and I just hopefully will be able to get the publisher to schedule those. I wouldn't expect them to come out immediately, but hopefully in the course of the next year, those will come out. I've got the novel A Familiar Problem that I would love to find a publisher for, and I haven't been able to find one yet. It's kind of an odd, offbeat sort of story. It's about a young man who is in his magical training now supposed to get a familiar, but when he tries to capture a demon as his familiar, she captures him as her familiar, and then trains him to enter him in an illegal familiar fighting tournament. And so the book is about him getting trained and then being entered in the tournament, and then what happens after. I don't want to give anything away, but it's kind of a lighthearted romp in many ways, but it has some weird features that not everyone might appreciate, and so some publishers have found it a little challenging to take on. But in any case, I have ideas for doing sequels to those as well, and I have another series that I would like to write about a geomancer with an anger problem, that does kind of bread and butter job, just assessing land in a karst region where there might be sinkholes opening up, and she can see down into the ground and see if a sinkhole is going to impact the property. And so that's how she makes her day-to-day living. But she also gets called into jobs by the chief constable to analyze crime scenes because she can tell who was where when, whether there's anything buried, whether there are bodies someplace. And so she gets called in to do surveys associated with that. And then that leads her into a whole series of adventures. So that's The Ground Never Lies. I'm looking forward to writing that. I've been meaning to write it for a couple of years, but other things keep coming up. Getting the REVIN'S HEART settled, writing all the Better Angel stories, but maybe this summer I'll have time to really sit down and do The Ground Never Lies.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. So, what is your favorite part about being a writer and on the whole writing and publishing process?
I love all of it, to be honest. It's hard to pick out any one thing. I love the feeling of excitement when you have some new idea and you're just getting the words down on paper. I love it when I have some insight as I'm writing and suddenly realize a way that I can, spin things or twist things, have some interesting plot twist that I didn't know going into the story, and that it comes out of it. For a long time, I found revising to be kind of tedious, but I've come to appreciate that a lot more too, in that you find just very small things you can do that suddenly pump up enhance the drama of something, or make something flow much more smoothly so that it rolls off your tongue. And even just little enhancements like that, smoothing away all the rough edges, can be very, very satisfying. It's wonderful to get acceptances when you send something in, submit it, and then you get the notification back that it's been accepted for publication. That is wonderful. It's wonderful getting paid when money shows up in your account. It's like for getting paid for your writing. That's amazing. Seeing something in print, of course, is that's great. Getting responses from readers, having people come up and say, "Oh, I read your book last night and I couldn't put it down. It was wonderful." And it's just amazing to have that experience. I mean, all of it. It's really hard to pick out any one thing.
Uh-huh. Now, do you do all your own editing or do you have help
Oh,
from editors?
no, no. So I write. What I try to do is I try to write the very first draft that is really just the dialogue and kind of the action, the brief descriptions of what happens. And then I have two beta readers, my younger son and my older brother, that both read manuscripts in that form for me, and they can tell me at that phase whether or not it actually has a problem that they can identify at the beginning, that the payoff at the end is satisfying, and that there's this sense of rising action, that it's not too episodic, that I'm not solving problems too early so that it doesn't have a good, satisfying climax at the
Hmm.
end. And then in that very formative stage, it's much easier for me to make revisions. Once I've actually gone through and I've done all the revising, and then have somebody say, "Oh, wouldn't it be so much better if you could change the event so that this thing happened before that thing?" And then it's like, yeah, that would have been great a week ago, but like now, and that's really hard. Um, so I get a lot of useful feedback from beta readers. And then having an editor is just essential. You can't edit your own work. You need to have somebody else that edits it. And Steve Rudecki from Water Dragon Publishing has been really fantastic. My brother in particular has commented, he reads these very, very early versions of my manuscripts, but then when he sees the finished work that is published, he's often blown away at how much better it is. And a large part of it is because Stephen Rudecki is a great editor. He's really, really very good at being able to identify key places where you can add just a little bit more language so that there's a better reaction on the part of a character, that some moment of drama is enhanced, and that it carries through the reader more effectively. That's
Hmm.
what he's really, really good at that.
Okay. So, what do you consider the most challenging part of the writing process, and how do you overcome it?
So I would say that's got to be rejections. That when I first started writing, you'd send stuff out, and you'd kind of get your heart set on oh, I've sent this out, and then you just get back an impersonal rejection, and it would be kind of crushing. And I came to realize that what you need to do is you need to send something out, and then you need to be writing the next thing. So you're not even thinking about that other thing anymore. You're writing the next thing, and that's where you're invested. And then when you get the rejection for the first thing, you go ahead and you just immediately send it out to something else, and to another market, and then you keep writing your next story, and then you send it out. And then when it gets rejected, you then send it out to the next thing. And you need to just keep sending it out and getting rejections until rejections no longer have any real emotional baggage on you, because otherwise it can be very discouraging.
Mhm.
And don't self-censor, don't sell yourself short. All it means if something gets rejected is that the editor didn't think it was useful at this particular moment in this particular, for the needs of this particular publication. And it's not really a value judgment about your work. It might very well be that another editor will read it and think that it's wonderful exactly the way it is. Eventually, you'll get to the point where, it's been seen so many times, you're like, well, I guess I'll just put this in the trunk. But one of the traps I think that beginning writers fall into is trying to keep rewriting the same thing. Write it, send it out, and then start writing the next thing and devote all of your efforts to that. Don't keep trying to rewrite the first thing over and over again. Just keep sending it out, because it might very well be that it will hit with the right editor, the right publisher, that will think that it's exactly what they want.
How many how many publishers do you send it to at the same time?
Oh, usually only send it to one publisher at the same time. There are
Okay.
some publishers that will accept multiple submissions, um, but you really should track where you've sent stuff to so that you don't send something back to the same publisher again, because that's also a no-no. But you send it to a publisher, and so a big part of where I send stuff is to send it to the places first that I know will reject it fast. So Clerk's World always rejects stuff really fast. Generally, I would send stuff to Clark's World, and by the next morning, I would have already gotten a rejection for it. But just recently, I sent them a story, and it took, I don't know, 3 or 4 days to get a rejection. I was like, wow, it must have made it through like the first level of the slush reader, and maybe Neil Clark himself rejected it. Wouldn't that be something? But then I sent it on to Analog, and then they rejected it, and I sent it on to the next thing, and it's still there. That
Wow. Okay. So, what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
I guess my favorite adventure was that last summer, my son and I drove a whole bunch of books that we had on the East Coast, where we've been selling them at Aricia and Boston last year. And we rented a car, we put them in the car, and we drove them all the way across country to San Jose, California for BayCon. And we stopped and visited various people along the way. We went through the Badlands, we went to Yellowstone, we went up to Portland. We stopped at Crater Lake. We drove the coastal highway. So that was a fabulous adventure, and it was a wonderful experience for me to get to bond with my son. That was a really great, exciting thing. And then, of course, Baycon was fun too. I got to sell lots of books. I sold out of the REVIN'S HEART novelettes. I was selling them as little
Great.
bundles, and they were gone in just a couple of days. And so that was a lot of fun too.
Wonderful. Great. So, what is the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
I guess the thing that I just said about don't let rejections discourage you. That don't react to rejections emotionally. You just need to accept them and move on. And then don't self censor. Just keep sending stuff out. It's the fact that something got rejected is not an evaluation of your work. It's not an evaluation of the quality. It simply is a mismatch between what the publisher was looking for and what you're writing. And you just need to find the right venue for your work. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been relatively pleased with Water Dragon Publishing, is that they seem to appreciate the work that I do, and not the stuff that I write is a little bit offbeat, but it's the stuff I want to write, and that's, I think, the most important thing. Trying to write something to market, trying to write something that you think other people want, is probably a mistake. Write what you want to write what you want to read, and that's the best you can do.
Hmm. Okay. Do you have any other advice that you'd like to give to other writers?
But don't stop writing. I mean, just keep writing. It adds up over time, And it's like any craft, it's something that you have to do a lot in order to get better. The stuff you write early on, is not going to be necessarily very high quality, but the more you write, the better you get at it. You can't really say any more than that. And that's the difference
Okay,
between a writer and a non-writer, is that writers write.
correct. Very true. Are there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you would recommend to other writers that may have helped you with your work?
I think certainly for science fiction authors, SIFWA, the Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Association, is a really important organization to belong to, a network of science fiction authors across the country, that helps set standards for pay, for the contracts that people that publishers and authors negotiate, and can provide a lot of support if you run into problems, and just to network with other people. So that's certainly worth doing. I'm also a member of a local writers guild, the Straw Dog Writers Guild, which is primarily Western Massachusetts, and it's been really, I found it to be very supportive to have this group of people that I can interact with about writing, and that it's much broader than just science fiction and fantasy. But I offer a Straw Dog Writes weekly writing date, where from 7 to 9 p.m. on Wednesdays, actually. So tonight we're going to be getting together, and we talk for about 15 minutes for introductions, and then write for 45, and then have 15 minutes of chit chat, and then another 45-minute writing period. And it's been a great way to have, kind of shared accountability. That is just to show up, and some time that you work into your schedule for writing, and an opportunity to network and chat with people whose interests are often very different from your own. But it's always interesting to meet different people.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Just have a writing session with other
Yeah.
people. It's
SIFWA does that too on Sunday evenings, Sunday from like 5 to 7. But for some reason, it turns out I'm always busy on Sundays, and so I don't get to go to that one very often. They also have an international one that is at 4 in the morning or something like that for us. So it doesn't work out very well for me, but it's great for people in Japan, especially.
right. Excellent. Now I have questions about you as a person.
Hmm.
What is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
Probably that I'm just very shy. That we if we go out with my wife will dominate the conversation, and she's got this really really broad circle of friends, and I just sit there quietly and don't say anything because I'm just not comfortable with that sort of an environment. But of course, you can get me, just get me talking, and I'll spend all day talking. But I think people sometimes don't realize that I'm actually a pretty introverted person. I actually came up with a description of it, which is that at some point in my career, I started getting being the invited guest at conferences. And normally I would go to conferences and I would just sit off to the side, and like I could go to a conference and never meet anybody, never have a conversation with anybody else, just because I have a hard time putting myself out there. But when I was in the invited guest, all of a sudden, everyone wanted to meet me. And so because everyone wanted to meet me, it was no problem for me to kind of play that role. And I realized that I could do that even when I wasn't the invited guest. I could just pretend that I was the invited guest. So I call this
Oh,
reverse imposter syndrome. And so I can go and put myself out there and meet people. But having discovered this, I've discovered that I'm actually even worse than I was before. I just go off and sit at the side and say, well, if I was the invited guest, people could come over to meet me. They'd want to. And so I'll just sit here and wait for people to come and introduce themselves to me. Actually, working the dealer table in at cons is really very good for me, because I can just stand behind the table and people walk up and talk to me like you did, and
right.
uh, and and it's perfect. That works really really well for me. That I don't have to like go out and try and find people.
Right. Well, I think that being shy is probably one of the most uh, most prominent characteristic of writers
Yeah, if they were
because
out there
that's what they
talking to people
do.
all the time, they wouldn't have any time to write.
Exactly. But also, it's such a solitary existence. You
Yeah.
sit by yourself and with the characters in your head, and And you're right. That's it.
Yeah, yep,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay. What is or are your hobbies when you're not writing? And how do you make the time to do the things that you love?
Well, I have to admit that I lately have been spending a lot of time writing, but I've got a job as well, and so that takes a lot of my time during the academic year. I like walking. I like to walk around to gardens and natural areas. I'm an amateur botanist and zoologist, and those are things that I studied a lot when I was younger, and it's kind of nice now with something like Leaf Snap that you can just take a picture of a plant and find out what it is without having to go through and use dichotomous keys and look at floral characteristics and things. The computer will just tell you, oh look, that's winter aconite. Cool. And of course I do Esperanto and I write haiku in Esperanto. I haven't been writing much haiku lately just because I've been doing other things, and that's another writing thing. But I found writing haiku to be kind of like a moment of zen in the morning, that I could sit and just try and really get in tune with something that I was experiencing or seeing or feeling, and then capture it in a very small number of words. And so I've written, I've got several books of haiku that I've published in Esperanto with English translation, and uh, and so
Wow.
writing haiku is another thing that's a hobby, I suppose.
Okay. So what does your writing space look like?
Oh, this is it. We're in it right now. Um, it's this little basement office, and Uh, this house was originally had been turned into a rental for students, and there was some student who had a bedroom down here that they had constructed in the middle of the basement, and it's not a safe space at all from that standpoint, in that there's no egress from the space, but it works okay as an office, and I've got a bunch of bookshelves here. I've got a whole bunch of weird computery things from the maker projects that I have students work on. I've got a little fridge with beer. And
Aha. So you drink while you write.
but I have my laptop here, and then I have this giant portrait display next to me, and so I can have a whole page set up, kind of portrait style, and so it's a really functional workspace. Because I teach remotely as well. Due to my health issues, I can't go and meet students face to face, and so I'm doing all my teaching remotely, and so this is where I spend the vast majority of my time these days, is down here.
Okay. And when you're writing or editing, do you need to have some things with you, like to drink or eat?
So in the morning, I always drink coffee. I have a little thermosy cup that I bring down with coffee in it, and I like coffee in the morning. At night, I'll sometimes have a cocktail or beer, and drink with that, or write while I'm having that with me. And But other than that, I just need to have a computer. When I in the before times, when I could go other places and be indoors because you didn't need to wear masks then, I like to go to either coffee shops or places with fireplaces were really nice, and that I could set up my laptop and I could write in some space where there are people moving around and it's not quite so isolated. But one does what we can. Social media helps from that standpoint, that I'll write for a few minutes and then check something in social media and then write a little bit more. I mean, I can't write constantly. I write in little fits and starts and then do other things.
Hmm. Okay. And um, do you listen to music or do you need silence when you're writing?
I found that in the past, especially when I was writing in Esperanto, I couldn't listen to anything with English words in it because it would change my brain to being English rather than Esperanto speaking. But that's also true for writing fiction, as it turns out. And so I've discovered that listening to K-pop and J-pop doesn't do that for the most part. To have everything be in Korean or Japanese, um, then I can have that playing while I'm while I'm writing in English, and it's not a problem. And so I'm often playing J-pop or K-pop while I'm writing.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Now, writers often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions uh, to help them or hinder them through their work. And do you have any? And do they help or hinder you?
When I was younger, we had boxer dogs, and our boxer dogs, grew old and eventually passed away, and so we don't have dogs anymore. My mom's 91 who lives with us, and so we really couldn't have a big dog that would knock her over. But my son just recently got a boxer puppy, and so we go over in the mornings and visit her, and she's just a blast. She's wonderful.
Oh,
There was that somebody asked about Captain Tau, the boxer picture on the cover of Better Angels. He's a neo boxer, and which is not a non-human biological android. And she said, "Why a boxer?" And I was like, "I just always had boxers growing up, and I just love boxers." She said, "I expected that."
yeah, that's kind of usually what happens, I guess. If you have a certain type of dog when you grow up, you seem to get that when you're an adult.
I have a fan on social media who's written some fan fiction of Better Angels, and he wrote a little snippet of fan fiction a couple of weeks ago that had the Bebe and one of the neo boxers encounter a dog that's an ultra lab, and so I thought that
Ultra
was
lab.
cute. Yeah,
Okay. Um, I have two more questions for you. One is, where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? Because we can get Stephen's books at and get them for you at Annie's. You call us at 508-796-5613 or email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your books?
you can find them anywhere you buy books online. I'm not sure of any other place that stocks the Water Dragon books for the most part on the shelves. I haven't tried to pursue that aggressively, but once I'm still waiting for the hardback covers of Revin's Heart to arrive. I've got hardbacks now of Better Angels, and once the hardbacks for Revin's Heart arrive, and I'm sure that they're available, I'll probably pitch our local bookstores in the area to see if they'd be willing to stock a few copies of them to have them on hand. But yeah, Water Dragon doesn't have some big marketing arm, and so we're not likely to have them show up in Barnes and Noble or someplace like that. But you can get them at obviously if you go to the publisher's website, if you go to truckstop.waterdragonpublishing.com, you can find the Better Angels books there. You just go to waterdragonpublishing.com, you can find my books there, and they have links so that you can get it at Amazon, you can get it at Barnes and Noble, you can get it at Apple Books or Google Books or Smashwords, or there's a whole bunch of different places online that you can order books. But I would love
Okay.
it if people would buy them through Annie's. That would be fantastic. I love to
Thank
support local
you.
business.
And my last question is, how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
So the easiest thing to do is to just go to stevendbrewer.com, which is my website, and I post things there. You can subscribe to my mailing list there. I haven't done really a very good job about recruiting people to a mailing list, but I also post on social media. I post on Mastodon, and there's a link to my Mastodon feed that you can find there. You can see all my most recent posts at my website. There's a little block that shows them. And then I also post at Facebook as well. I don't really like Facebook all that much, but I don't. I used to do Twitter, but I'm not going to do Twitter anymore. Um, but uh, but yeah, so I stevendbrewer.com is the first place to go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen, for
Thank
joining
you.
me.
Yeah, it
And
was a real pleasure.
we'll hope to see you at our store sometime.
Yeah, you bet. I'd love to come out and maybe do a reading sometime. That'd be great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stephen D. Brewer.